Hello and good evening and welcome. My name is Mick Fealty. Those of you who are watching us on Google Plus Live, thank you for joining us. Farnez, thank you particularly for making it tonight. Lots of people, it's interesting. I've titled this really with a kind of a catch-all title on the importance of dreaming. And that does seem to have captured the imagination of an awful lot of people. I'm not sure all of them will have made it live to the actual broadcast, but it seems like people have certainly responded to that idea of dreaming. Now, just to give you a little bit of context, I'm Mick Fealty. I'm talking to my old friend and mentor, R.G. Gregory, or Greg as he's known to most of us on a more direct level. And we've been doing these conversations on YouTube and Google Plus for probably getting on for 2.5 years now. Some of them we've recorded privately. Many of them have gone out. And at the very beginning, we were trying to capture something around theatre and the politics of theatre and all of the rest of that. And we've sort of swayed on from that a little bit. And we're trying to capture some of the essence of some of the work that Greg and I used to do back in the 80s and 90s and even into the early 90s in theatre, in creativity, in particularly storytelling and group dreaming as one of Greg's kind of books has it. But we're going to touch on politics. It's a general election in the UK. But Greg, I want to throw it over to you first of all to kind of explain to me why you think dreaming is important and what important function does that carry for us as human beings?
Yeah, I mean, it's not dreaming. That is simply the thing that we do when we go to sleep and we have a dream, right? But it's a more general sense. But for me, a dream is the deepest expression of the spirit. The spirit is the thing that actually is there from the moment we're alive. Spirit means breath. The moment we start to breathe and all the organs of our bodies and all those things begin to work, then that body, that being is beginning to imbibe sensations from the world around. And long before we can use those sensations intellectually, we are actually responding to them at sort of a subconscious level, at a deeper level. And that's where the dream is, that we begin to get a sense of the dream, of the nature of the business of being alive. And when we get into communities and we set up these organizations for the running of communities, unless the dream of that community is still there, unless we share that dream, we actually get a bit afraid. It's like it's something that's embodied within us. But if we lose sight of it, if we dismiss it, if we push it aside and say, well, it's not, in inverted commas, the reality of our living, then there's a kind of gap between who we are as human beings, the nature of the effect of the universe upon us, for a kind of everyday fear of what's going to happen to us. And I think now, at the present moment, for all sorts of reasons, we're locked in a kind of fear about what politics is, for example, a fear of what the world is, a fear that the problems of the world are getting too much for us. And we've cut off the dream of what we want that world to be, what the pleasures and the wonders and the richnesses of not only the nature around us, but what we get from other people, what we share with other people. And it's that sense of dreaming, right, that is important. And if we lose that sense of dreaming, if we lose the sense of the whole for the part that we are living through at the moment, then we can't contribute in the way to the world that all of us is capable of doing, in the way that everyone is capable of doing. So that's dreaming at a level below, beneath the fears that we have about who's going to win the next election, and you know, how we actually manage our day-to-day existence in a world that is clearly unfair, that is clearly going off in directions that we can't control, but we seem to hand over the control of to people who happen to have the most money in their pocket or the most power.
Well, Greg, one of the things that I thought you said, and I've managed to note some of these things down on the Google Plus event page. If those of you are watching on Google Plus, when I'm not capturing everything, obviously, but one of the things that you said, I think, and I hope I've got this right, unless we are true to the dream which brought that community about, there grows a gap in us. And I think that's really interesting, that somehow there's almost a burden on us to kind of remember what it was that brought us together. What was the kind of social purpose? But that's too mundane in a way. The dream is the kind of thing that not the romantic thing, but the kind of imaginative thing, the imaginative nature of a given community. And it isn't necessarily, I mean, policy is obviously an instrumental thing. We have to put policies in place to make sure that certain things get done certain ways, and that they're particularly in the large-scale communities or societies in which we work in. But I'm really interested in that sort of governing, that idea that the dream that brings us together, that creates a sense of fellowship together, is a thing in itself that has to be remembered, revisited, and kind of brought forward and renewed constantly.
Allowed and not dismissed. It's so easy for people in power, people who run something, to dismiss what other people are feeling when they don't feel what the people in power expect them to feel. They don't use the logic that the people in power use to explain their power. To say we must be here because we're this certain kind of people. And out of that does come a kind of social commitment. Out of it comes class, race, gender. All those things become the excuses about why certain people cannot be expected to share the dream of the people who have the power. And the people who have the power are not really dreaming. They're actually, they've squashed their own dream. What they have is that I can make something out of this at this particular moment because I'm in the position to do it, right? And it's not a dream that embraces other people. It's to do with these principles of sharing and striving, right? We've lost the balance there. We strive. Our education system is telling us to strive, right? If our education system is telling us to dream, it's telling us to dream something that is to the advantage of the authority, to the advantage of the people who want to use us in a particular way. To share is to be able to sit back and say, okay, I am this and you're that, but we have a lot in common, and we can let that dream of that commonality grow within us.
Well, you have also got, so that you were telling me before we started broadcasting that there was an article that you picked up in the Observer newspaper yesterday, which was which featured a playwright whose name you can no longer remember, and I can't find. It was mad rush just before this conversation to try and find it, but we couldn't. But you had some reflections on that. This idea of story is the thing that is told from a kind of a central place, and out of out of the story that, say, at a general election, as the United Kingdom is in the middle of at the moment, that the story that gets told then is the kind of almost the legislative article out of which everything else then must.
Yeah, there's a movement, I think, and I gather I've not seen any of these plays, but one of them is appearing on television soon, I think.
We'll let the viewers know when we figured out exactly what it is.
Where the creative artist, the playwright, is questioning or looking at the politics of the particular part of the history that he or she is looking at, and is saying and identifying the fact that this what is making these people work is not necessarily true, is not necessarily to the value of people, but it is actually that the power comes from the story that they tell. That is, they get together, they invent a story that suits their particular politics. They tell that story over and over and over again, and people take in the story because people take in stories. We're a story taking in organization, right? And those stories then become almost fact in terms of how you win an election, the things that you the weapons that you use to win an election. And although I found myself in agreement with quite a lot of the things that were being said, what worried me was the use of this word story, because story is a much deeper concept within us. That is, it's not the fact of the moment that counts. It's that understanding, the mythological understanding, or the understanding through myth, the understanding through the imagination, the understanding through poetry, right? But understanding through the creative ability that produces those kind of stories that are of value to the human race. And what the politicians have created is a kind of ersatz story. And very often, not long after the election, we realize it wasn't true. It didn't even, it's not even telling the story that it thinks it's telling.
Okay, Greg, just quickly, Doug, we've got this great new facility, and I put out an appeal just as we were going live for people to put in questions to this Q&A app. So Doug Breitbart has stepped up to the plate and has given us a couple of questions. The first one, I think, is a good one. So, and it's really just a question directly to you, Greg. Before you get to the shared dream, do you need a sub? Hold on, Doug. I'm not sure what that means. Substrate of shared values first. So, in other words, do you in a group of collective people, is it important before you have the dream that you establish what your values are first? And then I'm going to take both your questions, Doug. And then the second question Doug asks is, or actually, it's a clarification. So dream in this context is a collective expression, not declared top-down, as in industrial era goals.
Not a top-down. Yeah, it's not a top-down. I mean, dream is a paradox. Dream is not necessarily saying apparently the same thing throughout itself. In this form of theatre that we're in action did, instant theatre, the dream, that is the final story, was made up of taking answers from individuals and accepting all those answers as true. And because they're all true, a different sort of story developed. That story is the collection of many different individuals, different views of where that story is going. But when you get the story and put it together and tell it, what you've got in your hands is a folk tale. And that folk tale, made up by that group of people in that room, is capable of some kind of interpretation. When you let it settle, when you put the story out, including everything that people have said, even though they're contradictory to each other, apparently, the fact that you then allow them both to be true means that a kind of fusion takes place. So, and in that fusion, all that is said is true, but it leads to a statement that is more than the individual statement, more than the it's a collective statement that is a summary, a collection of all the individual statements, right? But it fuses together into a human view of what it, of what that particular story may be talking about. And very often the story is not talking about the facts of the story at all. They're talking about the depths of the human experience that has gone involuntarily into that, into the making of that story. And I think
so in this context, I mean, when we talk about instant theater, Doug, and whoever else is watching us, we're kind of talking about a very specific structure to do a very specific creative job, if you like. It's about creating stories collectively by asking neutral questions and building up a collective story in which paradox plays a very strong part. And in your reference to industrial era goals, you're talking about a kind of a machine which is very familiar to us, even at the beginning of the 21st century, which doesn't really allow for paradox, which is Cartesian in the sense that it's, as of Descartes, I think, therefore I am. There are, as my late mother used to say, only two ways of doing a thing. There's the right way and the wrong way. Whereas this other sort of group dreaming mechanism, instant theater, as we called it back in the day, that is about creating a kind of a collective expression. And I thought, Greg, one of the things that you said earlier on that was interesting was this idea of getting underneath the fear that you won't hit that deadline, the fear that this thing is going to happen and it'll be too big. And you won't be able to, and constantly it's the machine, the industrial age machine, that takes over the preoccupation of what is possible and what is not possible. And the only way, in some respects, the only way to kind of escape current parameters is to dream new ones into existence through creative endeavor.
Yes, I mean, somebody the other day in some paper was saying that we ignore the poetry of living. That actually poetry may seem a silly thing, but actually it's through poetry, through creative work, that the artist, whatever, is beginning to probe underneath the conventional view of what it is to be alive into another picture, into another sense of what is there to be explored. And it's that sense there's something to be explored. Now, I happen to think that the human race at the particular moment, which is in quite a dire state, that is, it's in a dire state because humanity that doesn't seem to have a political system at the moment that is able to cope with the pressures that are upon this earth, both physical, psychological, all sorts of things. And we don't know what the answers are to them. And that's what creates a lot of the fear, that the sense that it's going too big for us. And my conclusion from that is there are actually three choices that the human race faces, right? It gives in to the machine. The machine is already cleverer than the human being. So a lot of people say, a lot of people argue, right? We become machines. We lose that which makes us, allows us to have these paradoxes within us, and we become the machine. Or we can't cope and we disappear. And that's not so unlikely that, you know, all sorts of living things have disappeared. Or the third way I call the Frail Bridge. That is this bridge that is difficult to walk on, difficult to get across, right? And that's the imaginative bridge. That's the bridge that is actually treading very, very carefully And seeing that, if we can get across the Frail Bridge and we can actually bring totally different terms into what makes our life worth living, then there is a chance for a completely new set of blooms. And I think that we're kind of close to that in a way. But that's where the dreaming comes in. It's impossible. Okay, it's impossible. But there are a lot of things that have been impossible in the past that have turned out to be possible, right? You can't have a new political party because if you don't vote for the big parties, right, then the old party gets in. But actually, the Labour Party came out of nothing when it was, you know, a few centuries back. That small things do grow, and old things, big things that can't cope with its problems anymore, they die off. Now, it might mean that that's not going to happen this election or whatever, but the fact is that we are entitled to dream because dreams are impossible, but it is out of the dream that the possible comes. And that's what you know, you take a story is there, people mull over the story, like in folk tales, they tell them over and over again. And then out of that comes a human truth. The truth unveils itself. And that truth then becomes the possibility of tomorrow. And that's a movement from the spirit to the symbol to the building, the shape, the form that we create. And out of that form comes the everyday, the new everyday, the new possibility. And that's where the dream is important, I think. That makes sense to me. It probably doesn't to other people, but it's that sense of the imaginative moment, not an imagination that has to tie itself to the reality of the day, because the reality of the day is not necessarily the reality of tomorrow.
Okay. Now, there's something here. I've got another question coming up from Becky Coleman. Thanks, Becky, for sending that in. And I will come to it. But and it's interesting you've asked the question you've asked, because at a certain point in this conversation, I wanted to push in something that was a little more practical, a much more kind of grounded, less to do with the dream itself and more to do with kind of standing back from the machine and looking at the landscape from a different direction. And it's politics. It's contemporary politics. It's by a guy called Chris Dillow, who writes a brilliant economics blog called Stumbling and Mumbling. Chris writes about the markets, and he kind of, but he's a confirmed Marxian. He sees things in Marxian terms, and yet he earns his day job is actually a kind of writing about the market. So he kind of understands the beast of which he talks. And I love his strapline, in which he calls himself an extremist, but not a fanatic. Anyway, he yesterday or on Friday, I think he endorsed the Green Party, much to the consternation of many of his readers and a lot of other kind of serious commentators who read him on a regular basis. So I'm just going to read 2 paragraphs off the top of this. My qualified endorsement of the Greens has led to some consternation. How can an economist endorse a party which has some Fruit Loop ideas? I suspect that some of this bemusement is a form of culture shock. It arises from the gulf between my perspective as an economist and that of Westminster bubble think. From my perspective, the main parties are just daft. They are promising to cut the deficit, although this risks exacerbating any future slowdown, and ignores the fact the negative real rates make this a great time to invest in infrastructure. They want to curb immigration, even though there's no economic case for doing so, and such curbs might hurt long-term growth. They are silent on the UK's single biggest economic problem, which is stagnant productivity, and have no ideas about what to do about the banks beyond regarding them as a magic money tree. you'd never guess from the election debate that it was the banks that caused the crisis. Now, I haven't read that out to endorse the Green Party. I certainly haven't read it out to kind of give fire to kind of a political argument around this. But I think what's interesting about that conversation, or that it is that economically, Chris is much respected even by Westminster insiders. But from the way he looks at it, it's almost as though he's criticizing them from the point of view that they've refused to dream, that they've kind of been captured by the wants, needs, and the power of the machine that they're elected to administer, or at the very least oversee, and that they're missing a whole bunch of other possible actions. So that's that. Now, what I want to do is to go straight to, because we're going to run out of time very quickly, is to go to this question. Hold on, where are we? Have I lost you? Becky, yes. Here we go. Have been party to many dreams and wishes committees and discovered that the diffuse and unlimited prospect produces unworkable outcomes. I wonder if we'd be better to bind our dream sessions with sensible limits, monetary limits, for instance. Greg, I think there's a charge in there that dreaming is fine, but bringing it to earth and making it happen is the thing certainly we haven't legislated for or allowed for in this particular conversation. So,
I think relevant to that is, I don't want to dismiss the everyday, because it does work the other way around. That out of the everyday, which is all we have to live with, that kind of, the events are just like the answers in instant theatre, that this happens and that happens and that happens and that happens, and that very often these things are contradictory, and you get good news here and bad news there and whatever. But somehow they get molded into a kind of deeper statement of what is going on today, and they feed back into the spirit. The dream is not the reality, and we can't. But for me, but the dream is what is actually lacking now, and if the dream cannot make its statement, then I think the reality cannot cope with what it does. I mean, I'm not talking about a committee. A committee sits, I'm not talking about consensus. I don't think consensus works at all. I'm not interested in consensus. It's because consensus usually depends upon one or two stronger voices within that group to persuade everybody to go that way. I am concerned at a more abstruse level, maybe, but with the sense that the dream that people are entitled to share is the dream of everybody. It's not the dream of the people in power, that everybody going through the most miserable time in their life have a right to dream about something that could actually develop further. I spent 2 years in Africa. Africa's a very poor continent. But what astonished me was, when I was there, that happiness was not something that the West controlled because it was more able to cope with its own things. The happiness of the people that I met in Africa had a strange sort of spiritual quality about it, nothing to do with religion, but they got on with their day. I mean, things are getting bad, worse, I think, now in Africa than they were when I was there in the 1960s. But there's a sense that there's something pushing through the need of survival, but a need to survive in a way that actually lets us use the talents that are inherent with us. And I think that brings in our attitude to animals, our attitude to living things.
Okay. Greg, just we're getting close to the end of the session, but we're getting some good questions in as well, which I want to share, even if you can't comprehensively answer some of them. So this is from Doug Breitbart again. What part of what you're suggesting requires a creation of safety that enables the adverse and opposite to that enables the adverse and opposite to allow and enable co-acceptance, empathy, and connection transcendent of the differences and polarities.
Yeah, well, I mean, that to me is a question of form. We've got the form all wrong. I mean, you go to the House of Parliament, of course, I mean, you've got 2 rows there of people who by the form are made to fight each other. I've sort of been playing around with the idea recently of a totally different form and a different way of actually getting the people, the people, if we're going to elect people to a parliament where people don't sit according to their party, but they actually sit according to their constituency. And those constituencies are mixed up to make all the way round, as it were, a mix that those people themselves might not personally have chosen, but a mix that they have to get used to. So North and South are mixed up, you know, Conservative and Labour, whatever they are, they're mixed up. And they have to speak towards the centre. It's in the centre that the truth builds, not, you know, in a sort of a long line of I'll chuck this at you and you chuck that at me sort of business. It's the form that we have to look at. And the form, at some point, the form alters the content. And we rely too much in many things on the content of the moment. We assume it's the content forever. But
I think that's great. And listen, Becky, I'm just going to throw this one into Greg. I'm not going to ask him to answer it because I think you're making a good response here. Now, Becky says, and she said it to something you said earlier on, but I didn't quite exactly pick up exactly what it was, but that makes sense. The safe space provides room for specifics rather than generalities. And synchronous, whatever that word is, synchronous, whatever it is, that fits in exactly with what you've just said about form. The form has to be crafted such that specifics can be dealt with. So this whole story creation thing through the instant theater format, always done on the right, 2 short sides, 1 long side, audience the whole way around, and there are rules, and through those rules, a dream or a group dream, a group told story can emerge, and each one of those group dreams is dealing in specifics. Now, not the specifics of how you build a bridge, but perhaps some of the ideas about where a bridge might be necessary, or what story can a bridge tell of itself. And I think that contrasts nicely with what you were, the critical remarks you were making about this playwright, who said that the story has to be told and then the action must unfold from the story that is authoritatively told by whatever government or power authority kind of gets into power. It's as though what you're driving at is to try and create a space in which these dreams can materialize and handle specifics. So apologies to everybody else who's put in questions. We're really running down on time. I don't want to make these sessions be much longer than they should be, but what I will do is just quickly flick down through some of the comments that people have made without necessarily asking Greg to come and directly answer them. So Faranese Parsay says, I think poetry is the way to open the heart. Okay. And I'm sure there are things you want to say about that, maybe in some concluding remarks, Greg. Becky Coleman, can the small dreams taken one at a time add up to the big dream? In other words, are we aiming for world peace or income equality, etc.? without the ability even to accomplish the smaller aims of government. Okay, now, so there's a kind of a Russian doll thing going on there about dreams inside dreams inside dreams, and the importance of small action, not just the small action of individuals, but the collective action of government. Sorry, I'm just going to put that up on the screen now. And the last one from Doug, as he's listening to this and processing it, he's saying, I keep getting dream actually mapping to possibility. Okay, so, and I'll put that one up to finalize. So no more questions, please. Thank you very much. It's been absolutely fantastic. Greg, I won't ask you to kind of ruminate on each one of those individually, but if you could just kind of encapsulate some final thoughts for us on some of those themes that have been thrown up.
We've got to shift from the dream being the dream of authority to the dream being the dream of the people. What politics that turns up, what practical measures it turns up, and any fool can see that it can throw up some very, very difficult situations. It's there to explore. We don't know yet how to put the dream of the people into reality. So I take that last remark that was made about mapping towards the reality, whatever it was.
Possibilities.
Within this country, let me say, it's the role of this country and the West that has played the authority role for too long in this world, right, in terms of other countries as well. It's a worldwide problem, not simply the problem of the West or the problem of Britain or whatever.
Okay, Greg, thank you very much for that. And thank you this evening, everyone, for using the Q&A facility. That's the first time I've seen it, or the first time we've experienced that, myself and Greg, such great participation from the audience. It's always good. Often with these things, you feel like you're just pushing it out in the old conventional broadcasting way, but a real sense that people have come towards us with some really interesting and challenging thoughts. I think my own final thought is that in many ways we are a society which really knows how to do things. It just can't discriminate terribly well on which things we should be planning to do. You know, so we can map in physics, in theory, in the theoretical physics. We can map all kinds of things on the macro level, on the micro level, on the nano level. But it's that kind of perhaps dreaming and kind of reorganizing our societies around dreams and social purpose, agreed social purpose. Those are the things that we've underinvested in. And I think it's not simply I think translating those things into practice is less of a problem than articulating them and finding ways of actually finding out what the people's dream is. It's a great line, that, from Greg, but it's also a real tease to figure out how these things can be done. I suppose trial and error is the old-fashioned human way of doing things, and finding out what works from often figuring out what doesn't work. Anyway, listen, if you've enjoyed it, hopefully we will meet again next Monday at about 9:30. Keep an eye out on Google+. I'll send invitations to those people I've got on my conversation circle, and we'll take it from there. Okay, thank you for joining us, and good night, and thanks to Greg.
Thank you. Good night.